sustainability issues. People talk about, well, we'll need to grow, raise some growth capital, grow until we hit sustainability, and then we'll just go on in our fundraising. So, but to what extent is sustainability sort of a misnomer, and sustainability just means we'll get to a certain point where we maybe have more capacity to raise money, but we're only just going to continue to raise money. iMentor's in a little bit of a different place, because the idea is that there's a business that'll ultimately bring in revenue. But for those, Iris, I don't think I Have a Dream has a revenue generating model, I'm not sure. But also, as you thought sort of a little bit more about sort of the syndicate, the aggregation, and why that came into being.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the three organizations in our pilot have very different funding models, and one of them actually has a break even as a national organization. They get fee revenue from their affiliates, and they will hit a break even one day, potentially.
And
that's the plan.
The affiliates raise money?
The affiliates raise money, public
break even
dollars.
if they stop growing.
They break even if they stop growing at a certain point.
But is that because the affiliates are themselves relying on
affiliates
philanthropy dollars?
are not relying on philanthropy, they're relying on public dollars. So there's this large notion of where does philanthropy stop and where does public dollars then come in, and that's where I think the evaluation and the proof point helps you build that case and move to a place. But there also has to be essentially a market for it, from the federal government to provide that kind of takeout. On the other side, there's another organization that we're working with that does have that philanthropy model, right? And so their model is, getting the affiliates to get to a certain point where they can cover their own costs, kick something back to national, have national cover their costs, but they're still on that fundraising treadmill.
And what does the Growth Aggregator Fund do for them? What's the rationale between that and the growth aggregation?
Well, the growth capital aggregation gives them enough capital till they get to a point where, through this spurt of growth, they get to a point where their affiliates are sustainable. And, we can borrow this from George Overholzer at the Nonprofit Finance Fund. It's reliable, renewable, and replaceable funding. So when an organization gets to a point where they've developed such fundraising expertise that every year, they're at least confident they're going to get in what they made the year before relatively easily, and then they're only, kind of working hard for that next bit. So, it's to me, it sounds like, they're still on the fundraising treadmill. So, it's a big open question about what sustainability really is in the sector.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think it's all relative. I don't think there's ever any nirvana where all of a sudden, because the world changes. I think, when I think about what the critical pieces are, I think what you were saying about demand, making sure there's always demand for the product. And I really think money's got to follow the program. I just think at the end of the day, that's how it works. And Mike spoke to me, apart from my thinking about trying to fundraise, we're always thinking about, we want to make sure every dollar we take in and every hour of time we're consuming is the best use, of that dollar an hour. And I think once you feel good about that, the fundraising becomes relatively easier. And I think then other things like, I think the organizations that are relatively more financially stable are ones that have, vastly diversified funding base. For example, they will get a lot of percentage of their revenues coming from, thousands of individual givers, and that's not going to all crash one day. But I don't think they can even rely on that. That can go down 10, 20%, and that takes a big hit on them. So then I think that leads to, risk management, making sure that you can get through the rough patches. So I just think it's a whole slew of things. I don't think we ever feel, even at TFA that now has a pretty significant operating reserve, huge demand, strong boards at every level, strong political supporters. I think even at TFA still worry. It's not like they ever feel like they can ever rest on their laurels. They always have to think about it. So. And I don't think it's different from the business world either, like when you're maintaining a company.
New Schools Venture Fund, I know, is thinking about this, that there's a small group of particularly charters, where you put the money up because there's a few years of losses. You need to buy the building, or you need to run losses as the school fills. But if you're successful programmatically, you're self-funding.
Relatively speaking.
Very close to self-funding.
And things can,
And then there's a bunch of organizations that I think, I would say, hope is not a strategy, where they've never had any. They've all been national funders supported, but if we just hired 5 good development people, we raise a lot of money from individuals, and obviously there's a lot of risk there. But as Ira says, most of the ones that we see are somewhere in the middle, and there's no sort of easy answer. But one of the things that at least we're thinking about is, by the nature of your grant, you can hopefully reduce the risk. You know, what you don't want is that your 5 years of quote-unquote growth capital gets munched through in 2. There's been no parallel growth in reliable fundraising, and then what do? But, you know, Soros and others have been doing dispersals from capital plans that have been tied to how successful the organization has been in parallel in growing its sort of meat and potatoes fundraising. So I think there's ways that you can structure around that and reduce the risk at least a little bit.
We did that a little bit. Our plan has enough flex in it that, you know, our capital, if we get all of it, will cover operating deficits over 4 years, then we break even in the 5th year. And that's dependent on, and like I said, it reduces our philanthropy to a little less than 20%, but at the same time we're increasing our fundraising by 100% over the 5 years, but even in that situation, if that takes into account all the business coming in, all these new partners, which is still an improving thing. We're just going into our 2nd year. And so one of the things that we can do is adjust those numbers and adjust the way we're spending that money on the New York program and the national program to curtail and make sure that we're getting through to our break even, which should be the sort of the main objective of any capital expenditure. And I think the second thing that we try to do that we've been pretty happy with is build some of these more sustaining models into just how we do business. And so when we went out to go find great mentors, we found that corporations were also looking for great volunteer opportunities for their employees. It ended up being a very great match. And so what we're able to do is say, great, you know, Goldman Sachs, you're going to have 80 mentors this year. The cost per pair is $1,000. Why don't you cover your pairs for this year? And so about 35% of all of our funding in the given year comes from these corporate partnerships, which are directly linked to volunteer interest. So in some sense, it's betting on ourselves that we'll be able to maintain or increase volunteer levels at these corporations every year. But the more that you can build that kind of stuff into what you do, I think the safer the bet gets. But you're right, it's always a bet. It's always the gamble.